Hello all, and thank you very much for joining me today for this session in Fuqua's special issue LinkedIn Live series on fairness, justice, and race. Yesterday, my colleague in the management and organizations area, Ashley Shelby Rosette, discussed what leaders need to know about race in the US. If you missed that talk, you can find it right below this one on Fuqua's LinkedIn page. Tomorrow, Bill Mayhew, a professor of accounting, will discuss discrimination in bond markets and how it's affected historically Black colleges and universities. All of these sessions are at 12:30 p.m. every weekday through June 18th. So try to catch as many of them as you can. Now, before I launch into what I want to cover with you today, let me quickly tell you a bit about myself. Some of you I might have met at some point, many I'm sure I haven't. My PhD is in social psychology from Stanford University. Social psychology is a field that studies the psychology of how people understand others and how people are affected by others. And discrimination, stereotyping, and prejudice are probably the biggest and most long-standing areas of research within this field. While at Stanford, I had two PhD advisors, one in social psychology and the other at the Graduate School of Business, giving me a unique perspective on how to integrate basic programs of research with issues relevant to organizations and the workplace. From graduate school forward, my research has focused on social justice and inequality. I'm the past president of the International Society of Justice Research, and in my own work, I emphasize the individual, organizational, and societal factors that impede social progress and change. Now, what I'd like to share with you today is several research projects from my lab that offer perhaps a different perspective on inequality and discrimination in the United States than you usually might hear. My work does not study explicit and obvious racism or directly examine heinous acts of racism like those we have witnessed in the deaths of George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and so many others. Instead, my work looks at how prolonged systems of discrimination towards Black Americans and other historically disadvantaged groups also have more seemingly mundane causes. Now, what do I mean by mundane causes? What I mean is there are lots of things people express or lots of types of actions they engage in that may not seem obviously hateful or discriminatory, but nonetheless serve to uphold broad systems of inequality and racism. And these less obvious societal and structural features that are often unseen or at least underappreciated need to be addressed too. Consider some of the world's largest tech companies. These organizations have offered huge financial commitments to diversify over the past 5 years or so, but for the most part are failing, barely moving the needle. Good intentions clearly are not enough. People need to know what is preventing an organization or a society from achieving social change, and often it's more complex than only weeding out those who hold explicitly racist or sexist beliefs. In my research, I try to hunt for these hidden causes of inequality, the things that people or organizations are doing that might unwittingly be advancing a racist or discriminatory outcome, even when that's not what they intend. Some of my work looks at these hidden causes in the context of race, some in the context of gender, and some in the context of other types of inequality and inequity. Given the short time we have together today and my desire to answer any questions you have at the end, I'm going to just offer a few examples to give you a sense of how seemingly mundane factors contribute to ongoing inequality. First, I'm going to talk about research that I've done on what I like to call the insidious effects of positive stereotypes. Stereotypes are the associations people hold about specific social groups, and surveys generally show that most people think it's wrong to stereotype others. And indeed, in mainstream media, in most organizations, and in society in general, you see much less expressed stereotyping of, for example, Black Americans than you would have 50 years ago. But this reduction in stereotypes has a marked asymmetry to it. While negative stereotypes have become less acceptable to express, positive stereotypes remain much more prevalent and culturally acceptable. For example, and remember, these are stereotypes, not truths, we continue to see people freely express the idea that women are naturally more empathetic than men, that Jewish people are endowed with superior financial ability, that Asians excel at mathematics, and Black Americans are better athletes. For each of these groups, you can surely think of examples that are also negative stereotypes. As a Jewish person myself, for example, I know we are also stereotyped as greedy. But negative stereotypes, especially compared to their positive counterparts, are for the most part publicly rejected. Now, it might seem reasonable to you that positive stereotypes are shared and sometimes even celebrated, while negative ones are censored. After all, it would seem that negative stereotypes are the real breeders of prejudice and discrimination, But what our research suggests is that sometimes the exact opposite holds true, that the relative ease with which positive stereotypes can fly under the radar or evade raising red flags may ironically sometimes make them more damaging in this day and age than even negative stereotypes. So let me share you a few examples of this from our research. In one set of studies, and I think the links to all the studies I talk about today will be posted. In one set of studies, we randomly divided people into one of three experimental conditions. In each, we asked them to read media snippets and then respond to some questions. In one condition, the media snippet expressed the negative stereotype that African Americans are academically weak. In another, the media snippet was very similar, but instead expressed a positive stereotype about African Americans as superior athletes. In the final condition, people just read information unrelated to race. We then measured a few different things across studies. Now, what did we find? First, and perhaps not that surprisingly, people believed the person espousing the negative stereotype was more, in quotes, biased than the person espousing the positive stereotype. Also, people exhibited considerably more emotional distress. They felt worse when reading about the negative stereotype than the positive stereotype. And both of these findings are largely consistent with the idea that negative stereotypes set off red flags for most people and do so much more than do positive stereotypes. But the next two findings are where the real problems can be seen. We also measured two other types of beliefs. One was the degree to which people view societal differences they have observed between Black and white Americans as due to nature or nurture. That is, are these differences due to biological predispositions or cultural and societal influences? Tellingly, it was those who read about the positive stereotypes that then showed the strongest belief in the biological explanation. These people were higher than both the baseline condition and the group that was exposed to the negative stereotype. Now, this is a very big deal because these types of belief that social groups have different outcomes because of innate differences between them have been linked to a number of problematic outcomes, ranging from increased prejudice to less support for policies aimed at the redress of social inequality. What's more, we also measured tendencies to associate African American males with criminality. Again, it was the participants who read about the positive stereotype that African Americans are superior athletes that showed the biggest increase on this measure. They more strongly associated African American males with criminal behavior, and they did this more than not only those people who were in the baseline condition, but even compared to those exposed to the negative stereotype. Now, why does this happen? That is, why does exposing people to a positive stereotype, which seems complementary, lead to more negative effects than hearing the negative stereotype? In essence, it comes down to the fact that our abilities to discredit biased information that we hear and overcome unconscious stereotypes requires vigilance and motivation and effort. We have to try and we have to be aware. But remember that people only noted bias or showed strong visceral reactions to the negative stereotype when they heard the positive stereotype, which still offered race-based generalizations about people's abilities. It wasn't coded as such. So the seemingly complementary nature of the positive stereotype made people let their guard down. In this way, positive stereotypes can act like a clandestine delivery system, able to evade detection, but still affect judgment, and in ways that are not really positive at all. Now, before I move to a different area of research, I'd like to share with you one other finding from the literature on positive stereotypes that hammers home this point in an especially powerful way. There's a long history of systemic biases in education. Because of stereotypes about how intellectual ability correspond with race, gender, and social class, people of certain groups were long discouraged from high-status subjects, occupations, and opportunities in general. And because this, in quotes, tracking was largely based on negative stereotypes of intellectual incompetence among certain groups, the hope has been that this problem would largely dissipate along with those stereotypes. But positive stereotypes might undermine these efforts in unique ways. Now consider the following experimental demonstration. This wasn't conducted by me, it was conducted by my co-author, Alex Chop, with whom I published a piece that we'll also provide a link to, describing the ways in which positive stereotypes are problematic and deserving of attention. In this experiment, white participants were asked to assume the role of a career counselor and evaluate several high school student profiles and then provide career advice. Basically, they read the profiles of different high school students and they were asked to give them advice on how they should move forward. One of these profiles described a student who was struggling academically, though he was still passing and maintained interest in academics, but excelled athletically. The picture appended to this profile was manipulated across condition. such that half the participants saw a black student and the other half saw a picture of a white student. All other aspects of the profile were identical across experimental conditions. After viewing each profile, participants were asked to provide advice as to where this high school student should focus his efforts to maximize his future life success. Results revealed that men, and this didn't happen amongst women, but just men, who tended to endorse positive stereotypes, encouraged the black student to spend more hours per week on athletics at the expense of academics, and also ranked athletics as the most important domain for that student to pursue, even over academics. But when people were giving advice to a white student with the identical profile, they instead advised him to spend more time on academics and athletics, and ranked academics as the most important for his future success, much more important than athletics. Now, I want you to let that finding sink in for a bit. Participants in these two conditions saw the exact same profile of a high school student who was doing only okay academically, but excelling athletically. When that profile was accompanied by a white face, they thought it best this person study even harder to get his grades up. But when the face was of an African American, they suggested he spend less time on his studies and instead pursue athletics. Now, given that the number of high school student athletes that actually make a professional career of this sport can be nearly rounded down to zero, advising someone to sacrifice academic studies for athletics is probably bad advice. But because the black athletic stereotype is flattering, people may find it easier to funnel black students towards this path rather than one more likely to lead to career success, without concerns of appearing to themselves or others as racist or prejudiced. Interestingly, participants' negative beliefs about African Americans did not predict them giving this racist advice. It was only the degree to which they endorsed positive stereotypes that led to this difference. So it appears that participants were not discouraging black students from focusing on school out of malicious feelings or a calculated attempt to suppress the academic success of black students. Rather, these findings again speak to the unique influence of positive stereotypes as seemingly well-meaning schemas that ultimately and unintentionally can yield very detrimental results. These stereotypes are everywhere, and we go over it in our research, and are rarely given much thought because people do not anticipate the negative effects they can have. If we want to see less racism in organizations, we're going to have to stop accepting all kinds of race-based generalizations, even the positive ones. So let's now turn to another program of research entirely that also really bears on the current cultural context. This program of research was conducted with two Fuqua PhD students that I was advising, who are now both assistant professors at Cornell, Sean Fath and Devin Proudfoot. I want to share this research with you because it introduces you to a personality dimension or orientation that is pretty good at tracking resistance to change, especially change of the sort that is focused on race relations, social inequality, and diversity. It's called social dominance orientation. And what this orientation refers to is, roughly put, a tendency to believe that group-based hierarchy is good and desirable. In the research I want to share with you today, we are interested in how people who are high and low on this dimension would react to groups of minorities that are advocating for change. In this experiment, people learned either about the National Association of Physicians or the National Association of African American Physicians, and were asked about their support for the groups. But there was also another manipulation. The group was either described as well organized with a clear hierarchy, or more loosely organized without a clear hierarchy. What we found was that when the African American Physicians group was loosely organized, all people showed the same level of relatively high support for the organization. But when the group was described as well organized, people higher in social dominance orientation reported substantially less support for the African American physicians. In other words, it was only when change seemed a realistic possibility that people started to express negative views. Now, if you think about what we are seeing now with the Black Lives Matter movement, there are some important implications from this research. The most important of which is that when protests are relatively haphazard, without a clear organizer or set of leaders and goals, support might actually be higher than when the movement becomes more organized, cohesive, and clear in its mission. As the movement gains focus and organization, people who are motivated to preserve the current system for whatever reason will start feeling more threatened and then resist the movement even more. So in predicting obstacles to racial equality, it isn't enough to just worry that racist people are going to be against change, but we also have to prepare for increased resistance as the movement gains traction and becomes seemingly more effective. Next, and finally, I want to share with you some work on gender inequality in the workplace, because I think this particular set of studies offers a nice example of how looking at a more mundane influences on inequality can lead to actionable change that can make a real difference. Our lab is working on how to apply these same findings that I'm going to tell you about to other groups that face similar barriers, including veterans and Black Americans. This work is conducted, or was conducted, with two other former students of mine who are now both professors, Danielle Gaucher and Justin Friesen. Now, like I mentioned before, tech companies have failed to increase diversity. Many of these companies have committed tremendous time and resources, but fail nonetheless. It's in cases like this that hidden structural biases are likely playing a big role. Now, psychologists have spent a lot of time trying to understand the things that individuals do that might prevent women from applying to or thriving at certain institutions. But there's much less psychological research looking at the institutional level contributors to gender inequality. And because these more institutional level procedures can have a discriminatory effect, even if no given individual actually has any discriminatory intent, that is because they can be so deeply embedded in regular practices that no one even realizes what they're doing or what the effect they're having is, they can be especially pernicious. So they're a tough nut to crack. We looked at this specifically in the case of job ads. Now, for a long time, job ads literally specify gender. They were divided into different sections of the want ads and also use male and female pronouns to make clear who the ad was targeted to. This is an example of an institutional bias, clearly, but obviously not a subtle one. And it doesn't even happen anymore in the USA. Explicit sex segregation of advertisements had abruptly ended by 1993 due to changes in the law. So to many, this suggests that this problem was solved. What we found in our research, though, is that although explicit references to men or women as ideal candidates has largely disappeared, the gender of the ideal candidate is still conveyed in the ad, just more subtly, through wording in advertisement that reflects broader cultural stereotypes about men and women. We've analyzed countless jobs across a range of domains and found that masculine-themed words, for example, competitive and dominant, are far more present in advertisements for jobs that are typically occupied by males rather than females. And what's more, in experiments, what we found is by taking job ads and simply replacing some of the masculine words with less masculine synonyms, we were able to demonstrate that not only are these wording differences actually dissuading women from applying, but that this problem with the proper attention to language can be remedied. Now, if anyone would like more detail about how specifically the wording was affecting women's interest in the careers, feel free to ask, and I'll try to get to more detail in the Q&A. But you get the gist. Male-dominated industries tend to advertise for their jobs using more words typically associated with males and females, and this leads women to be less interested in applying. Change the wording, and the interest changes along with it. And what I'm especially proud of with this work is that it's been instituted by companies all over the country to positive effect. The research makes it clear what action needs to be taken to remedy the problem, and I've heard from many companies that have done it. It has even led to several firms that essentially exist to provide this service. So this is an example of a relatively simple solution that can be instituted via technology and policy to chip away at gender inequality. Will it entirely solve female underrepresentation in STEM, especially at the higher ranks? Certainly not. That's because there are a lot of these types of problems, but it can make a difference. And if we take seriously that there are a slew of these types of biases operating that we aren't catching, and then work hard to identify them and remove them, we can make a very large difference in aggregate. When we apply the same logic to racial inequality in organizations, we can see that whenever a group is largely excluded from organizations, there are likely many subtle and mundane factors, job ad wording being just one, that tell people that this workplace is not for them. So what will it take to see organizations become more equal? It will take, I think, a sustained interest from researchers on our side to keep identifying these types of factors, and also sincere interest from organizations to apply them. There's a lot of momentum right now pushing that direction. Organizations, at least from what they're saying, appear genuinely motivated to try something different and experiment with ideas. So I'm hopeful we can all work together across academics and organizations to make a real difference and see real change. Okay, so I will end there with what I want to share with you. And just before I start taking questions, I just want to remind you to be sure to come back tomorrow for my colleague Bill Mayhew's discussion about historic discrimination in financial markets. And I want to thank you all for making the time for this series. Okay, so now I will see if we have any questions. Just give me a second to scroll through here. Okay, so first question is, how do the wording changes in the job advertisements actually affect women's interest in these jobs? And this would be the same for wording effects, whether it be women or a different group. How is it affecting their willingness to work in these careers? This was an important question for us because we were curious about whether this kind of language was leading women to feel like they can't do these jobs, or they won't be good at these jobs, or was it operating through some other psychological or social psychological mechanism? And what we found was that it isn't actually affecting a woman's belief that they'd be good engineering or whatever male dominated career you want to think of. What it was affecting was their mental picture of who typically works at that company. When there's more masculine cues in the job ad, people, men and women alike, start imagining a workplace that is essentially full of men and has very few women. And because of that image, that makes someone feel like they're probably not going to belong there, not going to fit in there very well. And so the ultimate effect is they don't want to work there, not because they feel like they can't do it, but because when they're there, they'll feel like they don't really fit in. And so it's an important distinction that the way this effect is working is not that it's making people think that this occupation isn't for them. It's making them think that this workplace, this organization, is one where they're going to look or feel different from everyone else. Okay, another question. Wonder why is it so hard to break stereotypes? Okay, that's a good question. Well, at a basic level, stereotypes are imperative or necessary for people to function. And that's because usually stereotypes aren't in the social domain. So when we operate in the world, we have to start categorizing things and be able to make quick decisions without figuring out that every piece of furniture I see that has four legs, instead of having to experiment with it, if I just know that those are generally tables, that makes my life easier. I'm stereotyping, I'm using a category. When you move to the social domain, part of the problem is that people and the mind very easily picks up on patterns, tries to explain them without the right level of information, and people don't see or don't get a representative view of the world in general. And given that it's hard to move people around, to see everything, to experience everything, to know everything, the mind essentially forms these mental shortcuts. Now, the way that stereotypes will ultimately be broken in the social stereotype domain is when norms actually change in society. And so as the mind is seeing different things, and we're seeing it in Hollywood, for example, a good example of if you look at movies coming out today, and there's still problems, but coming out today compared to coming out even 10 or 15 years ago, the amount of diversity within the protagonists has started to move. And as people see these differences, the stereotypes will change, the associations the mind holds will change. But simply trying to tell your mind to think something different is very hard. And so this is why we basically need policy to be the main driver of behavior in the short run. Okay. More questions. What drove you to research bias and stereotypes? That's a good question. So what has led me down that path? You know, my PhD advisor, or one of my two advisors, is very interested in a theory called system justification theory, which looks to understand why people embrace the status quo more than change. His name is John Jost, and he had a large influence on me. More generally, though, I've always been interested on how things that people, on when sort of motivation or will kind of fails. And we see at a societal level, a lot of examples of that when it comes to stereotyping and discrimination. We see people that are trying to change, trying to make a change, organizations that aim for something specific, but aren't accomplishing it. And I really find fascinating the question of why is that happening? Now, I also just have a long-standing interest in social justice, promoting social justice, understanding how it can be achieved. And you put those two things together, and I end up in this space of trying to figure out why do certain beliefs become maintained even when explicitly most people are trying to change them. Okay. This question, I'm saying a question that it's sort of similar, I think. It's, if everyone has biases, how do we actually change our biases? And what I want to say there is that the human mind's always going to operate with biases. Biases are shortcuts. I think making the goal to change people's default quick thinking biases is a very tough one and isn't going to happen overnight, but only happens when people observe different things around the world and the brain makes different computations. That said, we can still change our behavior if we're vigilant towards it. So what we need to do is educate people about the situations in which biases are leading us down the wrong path, so that people have that red flag and think this is a situation in which what I just do by default might not be the right thing. Are there policies that can solve that? Or can I just override it by being aware of it? Rick Larrick, who's going to speak early next week, will talk about the challenge of sort of overriding our biases and de-biasing ourselves. And so I think he'll give you a good sense of some ways in which psychologists think about that. Okay, so another question here from Nikos. Do stereotypes make or break people? What role do other factors like culture, family, unit, etc., help people break out, like Barack Obama, Oprah, Morgan Freeman, etc.? Okay, so absolutely, no one factor is ever entirely causing all the outcomes that we see across groups. And especially when you look at any given individual, you don't really know what's causing things. We like to think about it as some groups or some people, because of their group memberships, have more tailwind and some have more headwind. Some people have to overcome more forces. Some people are sort of being pushed along more easily. And when you think of sort of the cost of diversity becoming more and more glaring as you sort of look up the management pipeline to more executives, or you look across society as people get older and you see the differences get bigger and bigger, people talk about this leaky pipeline analogy. There isn't one thing doing it. There's little mistakes, water's leaking out in all different spots, and we're trying to sort of plug those holes. There are certainly examples of amazing people that exceed despite whatever types of biases there were. And there are examples of people who certainly had all the advantage in the world and don't succeed. But when you look at the amount of things in aggregate that certain people have to contend with, it's a bigger struggle for some than others. It doesn't mean that people are at all destined to fail. It's just we're trying to level the playing field. So Scott McDonald, an alum of ours from New Jersey, asked, what differentiates your research from general observation that subconscious biases are brought forward? Okay, it's a good question. This is, I guess, it's the last one I can take. I'm happy to answer more questions via email later. Unconscious biases is basically just the noticing that if you have these unconscious measures, you will see that some people hold a certain belief about a certain group, even if they don't express it. So on the IAT, the implicit association task measure, for example, people may, without realizing, quickly associate, for example, old age with bad and young age with good. But if you ask them, they'll say, no, I don't hold that belief at all. I think people of all ages are great. An unconscious stereotype, we don't even know for sure the degree to which those actually correlate to behavior. What I'm looking at instead are things people are actually doing and saying, things that are actually out there in the world that may reinforce unconscious stereotypes, or they might not. But either way, they are actual acts people are engaging in that are creating inequality or discrimination without them realizing that those particular acts do. It's not that they hold thoughts they're not aware of. They're doing things and they think it's fine, but actually those things are promoting inequality. So that's the distinction. So I have a question here. How would your findings speak to racism against the Latin community? It's a good question. And admittedly, none of my research, and there needs to be more research, absolutely, specifically looking at that community. But in general, what my research shows is that if you find groups that are in some way disadvantaged, that they're being held back economically, and it seems to persist over time, then likely the same processes they're doing it for multiple groups are in play. The content might differ a little bit, but the same types of things tend to be operating. And I think it's a good question, and I would definitely like to start doing more research actually with that group specifically. Okay, we just hit 1 o'clock, and so our time is up again. I'm happy to answer more questions if you want to get in touch with me. Please continue to follow the series and Duke's LinkedIn feed. And again, thank you so much for taking the time, for having an interest, and I will see some of you at some point soon. So thank you very much.